Hello, it's me, Christine. Welcome to my little crime corner. Not to generalize too much, but I know a big part of many young people's lives is the thrill of moving out and being on your own. Be it a dorm room or an apartment, you may have 11 roommates, or you may be totally on your own. For today's case, we are in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to meet a young woman named Laura Kempton. Laura was a 23-year-old beauty school student, and she was also an aspiring model. Laura had been living on her own, and she had big plans for her life. Her friends had described her as having a big personality and always being very friendly and outgoing. In addition to her attending the Portsmouth Beauty School, Laura also worked at a local shop in downtown Portsmouth called Macro Polo, which is a chain and is still there today. Laura was single and enjoying the dating scene. On the evening of Saturday, September 26th, 1981, Laura was enjoying a night out with her friends. Later on in the evening, Laura had planned to meet a man for a date that night at a place called the Riverside Club for drinks and dancing. They ended up staying there all night and into the early morning until last call, where Laura ended up getting a ride home from her date. Laura was dropped off at home at around 1:30 and had invited her date inside. Once inside, they hung out and talked for about half an hour until they decided to go out again and try to find a place open to get some food. They did eventually find a place, and after they ate, they came back to Laura's apartment, and it was just after 3 a.m. when Laura invited her date to spend the night. As they were getting ready for bed, Laura made a point to ask him to recheck the door to make sure that it was locked. You know how in most of these stories, I always say this was such a small, safe town, and no one really locked their doors at night? Yeah, no, not Laura. She always checked and double-checked before she went to bed. A very good practice to get into. This was especially important since the front entryway to the apartment building had a small hallway, and that front door was never locked, so anyone from the outside could just walk in at any time. This wasn't a huge concern to the tenants, since they were able to lock the doors to their individual units. Every once in a while, a man named Arthur, who was homeless at the time, would sometimes spend the night sleeping in the hallway and would always leave very early the next morning before being seen by any of the tenants. He was able to do this as he continually went unnoticed. Before Laura's shift at work the next morning, she and her date went down the street to get breakfast at a local place called Goldie's Deli, where they got a quick breakfast and hugged and parted ways. Laura then made her way down the street for work. After her shift ended at 7 p.m., Laura then walked home to her apartment. She had made plans to meet up with her friend Karen to get dinner at a place called Luca's Restaurant around 9 p.m., as well as to see a local band play. One of the men that Laura had been casually seeing was playing in the band that evening, and she was hoping that he would come home with her at the end of the night. The girls stayed at the restaurant until just after 1 a.m., and they had a great time drinking and dancing and talking with the guys that they met there. As closing time rolled around, and after finding out that the man from the band couldn't come home with her that evening, the two girls walked back to Laura's apartment by themselves. Laura had invited Karen to spend the night, but Karen had declined, saying she had to be up early for her shift at work the following morning. After hanging out at Laura's apartment for a short while, Laura suggested that they go to a local place to get a coffee, but Karen was feeling pretty tired, and she thought that it was time for her to go home. After the girls said goodbye, Laura began getting ready for bed and did her usual check and recheck to make sure her door was locked. Late into the night on September 27th, Arthur had quite a bit to drink that night, so he decided to spend the night in the entryway of Laura's apartment building. He was crossing the street when he saw a man and a woman standing on the street corner right in front of the building's front door, arguing. He didn't want to be seen going into the building, so he just kept making his way up the street, thinking he'd just come back later. Arthur ended up coming back and quietly slipping through the door, where he spent the night on an alcove on the 3rd floor. Not long after he had dozed off, he was suddenly woken up by a loud crash. As he listened, he could tell that someone was arguing, but he couldn't quite make out the voices. Arthur decided that he didn't want to be there when the police would inevitably arrive, so he decided to make a quick escape through the back hallway. As he was making his way down the stairs, he noticed that at the end of the hall on the 1st floor, one of the doors was slightly ajar, and lights were on in the hallway and inside the unit. He could hear the arguing much more clearly now, and could tell that it was a man and woman shouting at each other, but he didn't think it was that concerning, and he didn't feel as though anyone was in any danger. At that point in the night, he just needed to get out. Just after 2 a.m., one of the building's other tenants, a man named Daniel, was making his way back home. He lived on the 1st floor, right across from Laura, and they had been friendly in the past, waving at each other in passing, and greetings here and there. They weren't really friends or even acquaintances, but they knew they were each other's neighbors. When he walked up to the door, he couldn't help but notice that the edge of Laura's door frame was broken, as if it had been pried off or knocked off, and a piece of metal was covering the gap from the inside. He paused, looked at it for a second, and could hear the sounds of someone rummaging around from the inside. It was 2 a.m., and this wasn't the time to knock on the door and investigate. He decided to just go into his apartment and go to bed, figuring whatever was going on probably wouldn't even be a problem in the morning. The following morning at 6 a.m., a building tenant named Rebecca, who lived on the 2nd floor, was on her way out of the building when she noticed that the door to the 2nd floor exit was slightly open, as if it had been purposely propped. This was odd and a little concerning, since this door was pretty much always closed and locked. Rebecca continued to make her way to the 1st floor, and when she passed Laura's door, she too couldn't help but notice the broken door frame. There seemed to be someone inside Laura's apartment, since Rebecca heard some music playing. She decided not to bother her, and she walked out of the building. A little after 9:30 a.m., a police officer had arrived to Laura's apartment building to serve Laura with a summons for several unpaid parking meter violations. As he approached Laura's door and was about to knock, he noticed that there was a small piece of the doorframe missing, and as he got closer to take a look inside, he saw the same metal piece that Laura's neighbors had seen before him. They thought nothing of it, but the officer felt compelled to investigate. As he looked closer, he could kind of see through to the other side. It was then that he had seen a lopsided mattress, as if it was placed on top of an oblong object. Underneath, he could see a pile of bedding and several sheets that appeared to be wrapping something up. As the officer looked closer, he could now see that the doorframe wasn't broken into with a fist or a hammer. Rather, it looked to be deliberately removed by prying off this piece of wood so the perpetrator could reach their hand in and unlock the chain's lock. Thinking something was not right here, he quickly called for backup. When more officers arrived and entered the apartment, they discovered Laura wrapped in a sheet under the mattress. After they had carefully removed the mattress, they discovered that Laura was nude and had several bruises and abrasions all over her head and face. She had what appeared to be a phone cord wrapped around her neck and shoulders, and her ankles had been tied together with another electrical cord. Officers quickly tried to narrow down the perimeter, as someone obviously had to break into Laura's apartment, as apparent by the broken door, and quickly checked out the apartment complex's other doors and windows, thinking perhaps this was how the perpetrator had left without being seen. After confirming that everything was locked, they did notice a screen that was on a basement window that had appeared to have been intentionally kicked in. Upon closer inspection, the edge of the window still had a layer of dust, so if someone were to have kicked it in and slid through there, they would have most certainly cleared away the dust. Presumably, they had just walked right through the unlocked front door. Investigators quickly began surveying the scene and collecting evidence. They first found a small piece of black metal that looked like it might have come from one of the mailboxes that was attached to the building's outside wall. They figured that this was the pry object used to remove part of the door frame. They collected the extension cords, as well as a cigarette butt and a glass bottle. They were hopeful that they would be able to recover some type of biologic material from these items. The inside of Laura's apartment, as well as the outside doors, were dusted for fingerprints, and several were found and collected from all over and around the building. Many, of course, would belong to the building's residents, as well as regular visitors, but some may have been from the perpetrator. Laura's autopsy was performed by a pathologist named Dr. Carlson at the nearby Exeter Hospital, where he found several abrasions all over Laura's head and body, as well as evidence of a severe beating. He also found evidence that Laura had been sexually assaulted. Samples were then taken to the New Hampshire Crime Lab. The next day, Laura's father had the unimaginably difficult task of positively identifying her. Police began interviewing people known to have seen Laura on her final day. They started with her friend Karen, who described their day together and how they had gone dancing and walked back to Laura's apartment, just the two of them, and how they had waved goodbye to each other the next day. They then spoke with Laura's neighbors, particularly Daniel and Rebecca. Daniel had explained how he had walked into the apartment building, and after he saw the state that Laura's door was in, he felt that there had been a break-in and actually went in and investigated his own apartment. The next person they needed to speak with was the man who had gone on the date with Laura just one day before her murder. He was cooperative and forthcoming with his information. He recalled how before they had left for breakfast the following morning, he saw Laura putting some cash in an envelope and leaving it on the kitchen table. The envelope was never recovered by police. Police were also able to locate and interview Arthur, who had told police that he had heard two people arguing somewhere on the first floor. He had recalled that there were people arguing on the street corner, which is why he had initially left and returned a short time later in an effort to avoid being seen. Police did show him a photo of Laura, which he positively identified as the woman he saw arguing with the man on the street corner earlier in the night. He also was able to provide a name for the man she was arguing with. He said his name was John. No last name, and no idea how he knew this. It is possible that he recognized him from someplace else, or just around town, or maybe Laura yelled his name during the fight. Let's be real, having a last name would have been great right about now, but just John is better than nothing. After these interviews were conducted, police then revisited with Laura's neighbor Daniel. Something just wasn't sitting right with them. He said that he had noticed that Laura's door was obviously broken into, and he knew that something wasn't right, and went so far as to investigate his own apartment. Detectives wanted to know why, if he felt so sure that there was a break-in, why didn't he investigate further into Laura's unit, as there was very obvious signs of forced entry, or at the very least, why didn't he call police? I can understand not wanting to meddle in someone else's business, but he could have, anonymously called police, had them come out, check everything out, make sure it's fine. I don't know. But I don't know the circumstances of Daniel's day, what he had going on. You can't hold people responsible or make them do anything. It just would have been nice if he thought to call police then and there. Also, Daniel's response to questioning was odd. When asked again about the door, he said he thought that Laura broke it herself and was fixing it. He thought her little fix-it project was nothing more than that. Okay, so it's a fix-it project now? It's not a break-in? Something still wasn't sitting right with investigators, so they asked Daniel to submit to a polygraph test. Daniel had refused to take the test, and he remained on the suspect list. Just a few days after Daniel's refusal to take the polygraph test, he called police to report that a light bulb in the downstairs hallway had been unscrewed. Normally, I wouldn't consider this to be a police matter, like call the super. Under normal circumstances, if you call police for something like this, you will most likely get a ticket for wasting their time and energy, but because we have a killer at large, they came to come check it out. Daniel said he thought it had burned out, but upon closer inspection, he discovered that it had been unscrewed and was slightly hanging from the socket. Detectives did actually come in and collect the bulb, and at this point they were hoping to possibly recover some prints off of it because they had considered the fact that someone might have intentionally unscrewed it in order to possibly conceal the hallway. As far as I was able to find, it did not appear that they got anything of use off of the bulb. Either whoever unscrewed it was very careful and they wore gloves, or the prints just smudged. I don't know if you've changed any light bulbs lately, but you're really not supposed to handle them with your bare hands, since the oils from your hands can damage them to the point that they shatter. Also, assuming that the bulb was on at the time, it would have been very hot, so they probably just... Real quick, since this little tip about the bulb went literally nowhere, we have to get back to work. Another look was then taken at the man who Arthur identified as John, who was the man last seen allegedly in an argument with Laura. Evidently, nothing more was to be found, and investigators did not continue to pursue him as a suspect. With the other evidence found in Laura's apartment, there was some biologic material found, but it being 1981, the technology for this type of testing was nowhere near as advanced as it is today. Luckily, various samples were found, collected, and preserved from all over her apartment for future testing, even though they might not have known of any of these possibilities. Because several things were taken and preserved from Laura's apartment, investigators were hopeful that some useful clues might be uncovered. The pathologist had determined that the blunt blow that Laura had suffered had come from a heavy object like a glass bottle. In fact, several glass bottles were found on the floor of her apartment. The telephone cord from the apartment that was found around Laura's neck, when tested, did contain some evidence of seminal fluid, However, no sperm was found. Several more samples ended up being collected and tested by investigators to the best of their abilities in 1981. In the spring of 1982, the investigation continued. However, no arrests were made and no new leads had yielded. The dark cloud of this unsolved, senseless murder loomed over the town of Portsmouth for many years as the case made no advances. It was seeming as though it might never be solved. It wasn't until July of 2023 that there was suddenly a break. Advances in DNA technology, specifically genetic genealogy, helped investigators shed new light and pinpoint a culprit. They believe that a man named Ronnie James Lee was responsible for the murder of Laura Kempton. Ronnie, who was 21 years old at the time of the attack, was thought to have broken into Laura's apartment, attacked her, and killed her in the early morning hours of September 28, 1981. Ronnie was living and working in Portsmouth at the time, and the vicinity of Laura's apartment would not have been a stretch. After a background check, investigators discovered that Ronnie had a history of breaking into apartments in the area for the purpose of robbery. They believe this instance was a crime of opportunity and don't believe that Ronnie had ever met Laura prior to this event. It wasn't like he was stalking her for weeks, he just happened upon her. It is highly suspected that he saw Laura as an easy target. Ronnie was in the U.S. Army for a few years, until May 15, 1981, when he began working for a security company in Portsmouth from June to August 1982. So he was confirmed as living and working in the area, as well as having reasonable knowledge of the community and its surroundings. He had previously listed his address as being his mother's address on Rock Hill Avenue in Portsmouth, further proving that he was actively in the area. He had been linked to 4 residential burglaries and 1 commercial burglary in 1983, and 2 of those he had pled guilty to. In 1987, he was convicted of several charges, including burglary and assaulting a woman in her home. He served jail time for these crimes from December 1987 until July of 1990. So, very short time. On February 9th, 2005, Ronnie had died of a drug overdose at the age of 45. Officials were adamant that if he were still alive, he would have faced first-degree murder charges for the assault and death of Laura Kempton. This was such a tragic case and so upsetting that not only was he never brought to justice, but Laura's life was so unnecessarily cut short. She had her whole life ahead of her and so much to live for. The only semblance I can think of for her family and her friends is that her killer will never be able to hurt anyone else ever again. If you live alone, check in regularly with your friends and your family, and if you're close with someone who lives alone, keep in regular contact with them. In fact, why don't you give them a call today? And that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.